The bell above the door chimed gently as I stepped into the small tea shop tucked away on a quiet street. Its walls bathed in the softest amber light, and the scent of cardamom and rose wafting through the air like a whispered promise. She stood behind the counter, her hands busy arranging small ceramic cups, her hijab, the color of early dusk, wrapped gracefully around her face, her eyes lifting to meet mine with a warmth that melted something long frozen inside me. I had come for tea. I told myself, just tea and a quiet moment away from the noise of the world, but the way she smiled made my pulse flutter, and when she said welcome, it felt like I belonged to a place I had never known before. She asked what I would like, and I said, surprise. Me and her laugh was soft like velvet. She poured hot water over a blend of spices and leaves, her fingers moving with careful elegance the glass, fogging slightly between us, her voice telling me this was her mother's recipe that every sip carried memory and longing and love. I took the cup from her hands, our fingers brushed, and I forgot how to breathe. I sipped, and the taste bloomed warm and deep and unfamiliar, and I watched her as she leaned on the counter, watching me, watching her, and in the silence that followed, everything in my world shifted. It became a ritual that I never planned but never wanted to stop each afternoon. I returned, always pretending I had nowhere else to be, always choosing a different tea, always leaving a little more of myself behind. She spoke of dreams folded small like napkins and tucked into the corners of the shop. How she had saved for years, how she wanted a space for people to slow down and feel at peace. I listened and nodded and tried not to stare at the soft curve of her smile or the way her voice made ordinary words sound like prayers. One day the sky turned gray and rain danced on the windows. She handed me my usual cup, but instead of stepping away, she sat across from me, our knees almost touching, her gaze soft and unsure, and something unspoken humming in the space between us. She reached across the table, fingers trembling slightly, and took my hand in hers, and I remember the heat of it, the steadiness, the way the world quieted around us, and all I could hear was the thunder of my heart and the softness of her breath. She didn't speak, and neither did I. We just sat there, hands entwined, the tea cooling beside us, and something deeper warming within us. It wasn't loud or dramatic or bold. It was tender. It was brave. It was the first time I had let someone see me, and the first time someone looked at me like I was worth seeing. I had never known how much I needed to be held until she did it without asking, until she did it like it was the most natural thing in the world. The days that followed were slow and gentle and filled with laughter and shared silences. She told me about her family and the fear she carried in her chest like a fragile teacup, how love in her world had rules and shadows, how every glance, every touch, every longing was a secret pressed between pages of a book no one else could read. I listened, and I held her hand tighter, and I promised not with words, but with presence, that she didn't have to hide from me. Together, we swept the floors and refilled the jars and opened the windows to let in the scent of jasmine and night. And every now and then, when the shop was empty, when the light was soft and golden, she would take my hand again, and we would dance without music, moving slowly between the chairs and tables, laughing as our feet tangled, whispering what neither of us could say out loud, yet holding on anyway, like we were learning a language with our fingertips. And every touch was a sentence, every sigh a poem. The tea shop became a place where time softened, where the outside world grew quiet, where I learned how love could be gentle and sacred and real. It was where I first tasted rose and cardamom and cinnamon. It was where I first saw her, not just with my eyes, but with my heart. It was where she first held my hand, and where I gave her every piece of me. Without fear, without shame, only hope, and the fragile, beautiful courage that love demands and rewards all at once. She had a way of standing close without crowding, a way of speaking in low tones that made everything else blur into background. Her presence was calm and grounding, like the first sip of tea after a long, cold walk, and each time I walked through that door, the world seemed to pause just for us. I would watch her tie her apron, smooth her sleeves, tuck a loose strand of hair beneath her hijab, and smile, like she had been waiting only for me. Even when she was busy, she always looked up when I entered, and somehow it felt like I had brought light with me just because her face said so. She taught me about leaves and spices and water temperatures, how everything mattered. How a little more of this or a little less of that could change the whole flavor, and it felt like a metaphor we both understood, like how love required patience, balance, care, how sometimes what seemed too bold or too subtle just needed time to steep and reveal its true nature. She never said those words, but they sat between us anyway, in the way she poured my cup, in the way our hands brushed each time, in the way we lingered when we could have walked away one evening when the sky turned that shade of purple that makes you believe in soft magic. We sat outside the shop on the narrow bench, her shoulder against mine, the cup warm between our palms, and she whispered that some days she was afraid not of loving me, but of being seen loving me, of the risk, the weight, the eyes that might not understand. And I turned to her and said, then let them never see what they cannot honor, but I will never stop seeing you. I will never let the world make you smaller. And she closed her eyes and leaned her head on my shoulder, and I knew in that moment that we had something the world might not always understand, but something the universe itself had made room for. We spoke often without words, the way her hand would find mine under the table, the way I would bring her jasmine when her eyes looked tired, the way she would press her cheek against my palm in the storeroom when the world outside felt too loud sometimes. We would sit in silence and just listen to the sound of the kettle whistling in the wind, past the glass, and it was enough just to be, just to breathe, just to exist together in that small corner of the world that felt like ours alone. She started blending teas with my favorite flavors, naming them quietly after moments we had shared, first blush for our first dance, cinnamon hush for that rainy afternoon, kiss, saffron stillness for the night. We stayed late counting stars, and when a customer would order them, she would glance at me from behind the counter. Her eyes lit with secret meaning, and it felt like a promise, like our story was being written not just in memory, but in every drop poured, every leaf chosen, every sip taken. Seasons shifted, the air turned crisp, then warm, then heavy, then light again, and still we remained steady, rooted in that little shop, like the steam that rose and curled between us, refusing to vanish. I met her mother once, a soft-spoken woman with eyes full of questions and hands full of grace. She watched us, watched her daughter, watched the way I looked at her, and after a long pause, she said, love is like tea. It cannot be forced, only brewed gently. And I felt something inside me bloom, because I knew her mother saw us not fully, perhaps not easily, but truly enough. The day we first closed the shop for ourselves, only for ourselves, we lit every candle, turned the sign to closed, and moved through the space as though we were both remembering and dreaming. We brewed the first tea we ever shared, sat in the same place where our hands first touched, and this time we held each other, not just with fingers, but with every memory and hope and ache and joy we had collected between sips. I told her I loved her, not with drama, but with truth. And she replied, not with fear, but with breathless certainty. And in that quiet tea shop, with the scent of rose and steam all around us, we became something neither of us had ever dared to imagine. And still, every time I enter that place, even now, even years later, I look at that small wooden table near the window. I remember the exact warmth of her fingers, the softness of her gasp, the way the world tilted gently to make room for us. And I know that love doesn't always arrive loudly, it doesn't always roar. Sometimes it brews quietly in the corners of a tea shop. Sometimes it begins the moment she first holds your hand and never lets go.